Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you very much. My name is Jakub Nowakowski, and it is my honor once again to greet all of you and our panelists as well during a meeting that is part of a series of meetings called Inseparable Difficult Subjects in Polish-Jewish Relations. The subject that we have prepared for today seems to be perhaps the most up-to-date current of all the subjects that we have touched upon over the last few months. But the whole project, of course, was invented and is devised at the beginning of the year. And it was difficult to envisage that the problem of fear of the other will be so up-to-date and so current. The title of the discussion today is Between Us, the Polish Fears, and the images in culture and the media. The fear of the unknown, the fear of having the myth dispelled on which we build our identity, the fear of confronting the uncomfortable, difficult truth, the fear of revealing embarrassing facts from the past, the fear of criticism, striking at the positive image of ourselves built with so much effort. These fears function both at the individual level and the group level, the national level, we could also say. They influence our relationships, individual relationships, but also our relationships as Poles, and they influence our story about ourselves. So what are the Polish fears related to minorities and changes in the contemporary world? The panelists today will be Bożena Keff, a poet, essayist, social activist, literary scholar. She published in the Midrash Republikanowa in Przekrój. She's been nominated for the Nike Literary Award twice. She's written, for example, the Anti-Semitism, Unwritten History, or a figure from With a Shadow, portrayals of Jewish women in Polish literature. Bożena Keff's books are absolutely important to read and also to understand today's subject. The next panelist is Konstanty Gebert, a psychologist, translator, journalist, academic teacher, a columnist for Gazeta Wyborcza, co-founder of the so-called Jewish Flying University in the 1970s, co-founder of the Midrash Weekly, the author of 40-Year War, the Place Under the Sun, The Wars of Israel. It's just a few of the books and achievements of Mr. Konstanty Gebert. Ziemowit Szczerek, for the first time in our project, a journalist, a writer, translator, collaborates with Politica, with New Eastern Europe. He's written academically on separatism and regionalism in Europe, nominated for the Nike Literary Award, laureate of the Politica Award. He has written Plateau with the Trident, Intermarium Journeys through the Real and Imagined Central Europe, or Mordor Will Come and Eat Us, or The Secret History of the Slavs. And again, it's just a few examples of the book that Ziemowit Szczerek has written. One small disclaimer, if I may, what might be important for Krakow. I'm more of a collaborator of Gazeta Wyborcza rather than Tygodnik Powszechny. Thank you very much for your comments. And Tomasz Żukowski, a literary historian at the Institute for Literary Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences, deals with public discourse in Poland and the functions of the image of the Jew in Poland and its role in the definition of Polish identity, and also deals with the narrative of communism in Poland and the post-communist narrative. He's written, among others, The Great Whitewash, How We Have Forgotten the Post-Good Jews, or Under Pressure, Exclusion and Holocaust Narrative. He's the co-author with Elżbieta Janicka of a book, Anti-Semitic Violence, New Polish Narratives About Jews After 2000. Let me welcome you all very cordially. We are truly honored that you have decided to join us today. The discussion will be moderated, like almost all the previous discussions, Kazimiera Szczuka. Let me thank you, all the institutions that have made it possible. So the Evans Foundation and the Koret Foundation. I'd like to mention our partners, which are the Institute of Jewish Studies of the Jagiellonian University of Krakow, and our media patrons, Gazeta Wyborcza, Radio Kraków, Hidusz, and New Eastern Europe. I'm finishing my long introduction, but because it is our last meeting of our series of Inseparable, I'd like to thank Kazimiera Szczuka once again for all the meetings that she's moderated so far. I'd like to mention some of my collaborators that have made this project possible. Ada Kopeć-Pawlikowska, first of all, Tomasz Strub, Mariusz Wójcik. I'd also like to thank Ada Musiał, the interpreter who's interpreted all of these meetings. Thank you very much. I'm passing the floor to Kazimiera Szczuka. Thank you. So we have started, entered a mood of departure already, but indeed, this is the last meeting whose aim is to summarize the whole year of our meetings. And first of all, I feel that moderating these meetings, I discovered that almost everybody knows each other. The people who've been invited as guests have also been people that I know, and this has been a bit strange. Does it mean that the people in the group that deals with the Polish relations is actually so small? People who write about it, who deal with it, who touch upon or explore the subject of otherness, of alienness. Of course, not everybody that deals with the subject has been present in the meetings, but it so seems that the circle, the milieu dealing with these subjects is actually so small. Let me start with you, Bożena. And I've known Bożena for 30 years or so, or at least 20 odd years. So I'd like to ask you how you see it, how you see the subject over the years, how it's been changing. Perhaps the question of the Polish-Jewish relations over the years, and the issue of the attitude of Polish society towards otherness of different kinds, that Kuba Naukowski has mentioned. Is it worse? Has it changed for the worse, or is it changing for the better? How do you see it? Because this is what you deal with, or you've been dealing with for so long. I can't say if it's changing for the worse, or what is your impression? How do you see it? How do you view it? This is what I'm aiming at, yes. I can't say if it's getting worse, but I think it's very bad. We've reached the bottom, I feel, because I can't say if it's changing for the worse, or if something that's been hidden for so long has now come to the surface. Is visible, conspicuous, because the conditions are favorable for it to surface. Secondly, I'd like to say that I think that the milieu of people who deal with, well, what do they deal with? How should I phrase it? But, well, it's people who deal with Polish-Jewish relations historically, or our imagination, our visions of these relations. Because at the moment, the Jewish minority in Poland is so minimal. So I could say that for such a small, minimal minority, that despite this fact, there is still quite a lot of people who deal with this subject. So the question is, why do so many people deal with what is actually so, what I think is it's a historical reality, and so perhaps it's also about something else. And I think that it definitely is bad, also because I don't want to refer to our subject, because the because not many people dispel the myths, and many people create those myths or maintain them. So however we try to dispel those myths with our little fingers, we won't catch up with the process of creating those myths, because those myths are created, maintained, assembled in an institutional way, at least for two big institutions, by the state and the church. What I mean by the state is, I don't even know how to say it, but I mean the state TV, the state radio, which are very political and party media, mouthpiece of the leading party. So this is how I would start the question with. Konstanty Gebert. Perhaps your vision is the broadest in the geopolitical sense. You know, a lot of regions and countries with very complex relations, including genocides. Do you think that Poland, the situation in Poland, is changing for the worse, or is it perhaps some kind of breakthrough happening? Something we haven't just mentioned yet. I don't know if it's changing for the worse. It's definitely worse, but I'm not sure if it's specifically worse in the with regard to the question of Polish-Jewish relations. Poland has become a worse country to live in, a worse country to inhabit. The minorities feel it always a little bit more, but of course, it is incomparable with the places where a country becomes a worse country to live in the very little sense, because people get killed. So from this perspective, this kind of perspective, we're doing very well, and we have to bear it in mind that we live in a world that is rich, affluent, free, and safe, and this world is a bubble on the surface of the planet where most people are not affluent, secure, and definitely are not free. But with this restriction, I'd like to make two restrictions here. One is that due to what Bożena mentioned, that there are so few of us, fear does not play a big role. Usually when the relations between the majority and minority are getting worse, then the minority is usually afraid that they're going to get beaten up. So much effort has to be put actually in the fact to find possible Jews to be beaten up. So most probably a non-Jewish Polish Democrat will get beaten up rather than a Jew. So I don't have that traditional Jewish fear that a Jew will be beaten up. And finally, and I think we have to remember this, we Jews are also nevertheless in a luxurious situation. My friends Roma are not allowed to enter cafes because they're too dark. Being a Muslim in Poland and being openly Muslim is an act of courage in Poland. And being a refugee in Poland, especially if you're a refugee on the Polish-Belarusian border, this could mean a death sentence. So in comparison to all these other situations, we Jews actually, our situation is not so bad. But at the same time, I think it's bad for a somewhat unobvious reason, namely we don't have a common world. The way I think about Poland as a place and as a certain duration is so much different from the way a typical non-Jewish Pole thinks. I don't mean, of course, about the so-called scums. I mean about, say, ordinary people, and the narratives of those two groups are so radically different. And I don't really think that there is a possible chance to get to talk to each other honestly. And I think it comes from a certain fundamental mistake. And I was watching the the August agreement being signed in 1980, solidarity, and of course I felt so emotional. I had the feeling that we were kind of reaching out to freedom. We have entered the space of freedom. We feel the fresh air. And at a certain point, Lech Wałęsa says, we've talked to like a pole to a pole. He says to Agielski, the communist leader. So, and I said, fine. So you've talked. And is there a place for me in this space? So this is the fundamental problem, namely that Poland, better or worse, sometimes wonderful, sometimes horrible, is a place where a Pole talks to a Pole. And if someone has the bad luck of not being an ethnic Pole, but a Jew, a Roma, or a Belarusian, or gay or Russian, then he doesn't take part in that discussion. And if he doesn't take part in the discussion, how are we to talk to each other? He takes partially, says Kazimiera Szczuka. He doesn't have to take partial parts, says Ziemowit Szczerek. I think it's a question. It's a matter of not so much of who is to take part in the discussion. I think it doesn't have to do with. I think it's changed. It depends on the definition of the Pole, and the definition is changed. At first, in the past, it was a nobleman who was a Pole only. Then the new concept of the ethnic nation appeared. That has stayed with us, and fortunate project sheds light on the present. But it's enough for us to actually agree that we should come up with a term, with a noun that refers to calls someone who is a member of the republic, someone who a term that would move beyond the ethnic borders. I have a problem with looking at those who take part in the discussion about the common space, whatever the ethnic origin is or religious origin, etc., etc. And looking from this perspective, I see to what tragedy we've been led to as citizens of the Commonwealth, Polish Commonwealth or Polish Republic, the unfortunate division into or between Poles and Jews. I tend to think that to accept Germanness as also kind of inculcated into the shape of the Commonwealth and Polish Republic, Jewishness being part of it. Because if someone is or has been a member of that common community, then you, for so many years, you can't treat them as someone who's not included into the discussion. So if you look at the whole of this construction of the state, the historical construct of what Poland is, that goes beyond the ethnic divisions, that we could actually suddenly discover that we could see the division lines as being completely different. We could suddenly come to the conclusion that the division line between nobility and the townspeople and peasants suddenly became so radical that we have. So we actually got rid. We actually discarded big parts of the Polish nations. Many people said that there was no townspeople, no burghers, and the fact is actually that nobility considered them competitive in terms of trade, and that nobility excluded them from Polishness. So we've got sort of fixed focus on the divisions, or ethnic divisions. And I think we are simply very good at breaking up our community from inside. We don't need anyone from the outside to break up our community. So why is this that way? I think I tend to think to think about our region of Central Europe as a set of asteroids between planets who attract each other so much that we cannot actually create our own center of gravity. Say when the nobility pressed the inhabitants of towns who've lived here, who had lived there for so many years, and considered Poland their own landscape, and if they had been discouraged from Polishness, be it ethnic German townspeople or Polish people, the index, the National Democrats, Nationalist Poland, accused Jews of not assimilating, and discarding townspeople from Polishness resulted actually in many townspeople turning towards the German identity, and it was many of those townspeople who with time were the strongest proponents of German at the time, where German identity also appeared and felt attracted to German identity. It was the same on the Russian side. So there are also influences of those big neighborly gravitational fields are perceptible, and I think to a large extent this is the cause of our problems. We've had attempts at creating some pan-national structures, certain kernel centers like the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania, the Habsburg Empire. They all fell apart with time. They were not able to survive the division between the West, which is Germany in our case, and the East and the South, that is the Ottoman Empire in the South. So in cutting it very short, this is how I see it. Konstanty, I understand you wanted to say something. Just to briefly reply, my mother ended in the Soviet Union during the Second World War, and she ended up in Tashkent, and she was dying in the street with typhus. And some unknown family took her home and made her recover, which was an act of courage, not only because typhus was greatly contagious, but also because NKVD did not support the idea of taking care of aliens. And when my mother recovered, the landlord asked her where she was from, and she said she was from Poland. And what is Poland? What is this thing like Poland? It's a country in Europe between Germany and Russia. Between Germany and Russia, there's no space for any country there. And this is where we live, actually, don't we? Yes, but I think, and I'm turning now to Tomasz Żukowski. I think that perhaps like Bożena, your way of thinking about the things we are discussing is that the Jews and the Holocaust have created a matrix which is not easy to surpass. That after all, this traumatizing experience of a genocide in the Polish lands, occupied Poland, the very fact of a minority disappearing, and the disappearance of Jews, so almost final, has left traces that, in a way, are work influencing the common awareness and create mechanisms that are therapeutical mechanisms, until we have not got through, after we have not actually come out, talked over the problems, made people aware of these problems, of what actually happened here. if we don't do it, the larger homogeneous community will be easy to manipulate, to make them quarrel, set them against each other. Perhaps this is what is happening. Perhaps this is the first stage of the debate, and it has to be very, very fair. If well, part of this debate is to commemorate Poles rescuing Jews in Treblinka, then perhaps it's very fierce. Tomek, what do you think? I think that, first of all, the memory that we're speaking about is not so much the memory of witnesses that are separated from the events with the police tape and did not take part in those events, but it's a memory of complicity at various different levels. Like Michał Głowiński mentions in his memoirs that the Jewish boy enters a cafe to wait because help is being organized for him after he's left the ghetto, and immediately he hears a discussion being waged whether he was Jewish or he was not Jewish. So from and on the other hand, you have situations where violence was very open. So all these situations was a situation where Jews were visible to the occupiers, and when the final solutions was possible because they had nowhere to find. And what we have actually problems to overcome is the memory of our complicity. You asked about if it's better or worse. So what I deal with is I mostly deal with the mainstream of our discourse, with the intellectuals, intelligentsia. And when I started, I thought that the biggest problem was not the right wing, but is the biggest problem is the liberal center. In the liberal center, we have quite a lot of mechanisms, discursive mechanisms, that prevent us from crossing a border, which would allow us to look critically at ourselves. And this would mean to notice exclusion, which is present in Polish public life, and which is the exclusion of the Jews, but not only. And I think that over the last 20 years, and although it's worse than, after all, nevertheless, things are changing in the mainstream. Perhaps you remember the day of the so-called cursed soldiers, who in many cases murdered Polish Jews after the end of the Second World War. I strongly recommend Joanna Tokarska-Baki's recent book. So the day of the commemoration of the cursed soldiers was actually introduced by President Komorowski, so a representative of the liberal center in the Polish public life. But a lot of things have been changing here. I think that for the last 20 years, what's happened, a voice that is critical towards the center, towards this liberal center, and that is able to look self-critically at the exclusion within the mainstream. So this kind of voice is heard more and more and is accepted more and more. People get to listen to it, and you can speak about it publicly. I'm not saying that you can speak on the Polish TV, but you can speak about it in Gazeta Wyborcza. 20 years ago, it wasn't possible. So I think that in this respect, there is a change for the better. And I think that there is some hope. One smaller issue to it was about Jan Tomasz Gross and his text. And as you know, he asked Lipski and Bartoszewski whether he should publish this text, and they were very critical about publishing this text. And those voices were full of stereotypes. And Smolar, in his letter to Gross, said that he wouldn't like this text to be accepted by the so-called friendly societies, to be as a voice of Jews who accuse Poland, because this is part of the Jewish soul. So I think that at the moment we are starting to consider those friendly circles, and this is a good sign. So it's this from me for the time being. I quite don't understand what you're trying to say. liberal center, which forbade us from speaking about Poles murdering Jews. So you think that now that the liberal center has sort of got matured and is ready to talk about it, so we're not interested with the right wing. The right wing is less of interest to us because the victory of the right wing was a result of no resistance from the center. There's certain patterns of culture, but let me point your attention to the fact, Tomek, that what you call the liberal center, even by quoting names like Smolar or Gross, these were people who were afraid to be the bearers of sort of to be the first and a strong debate, because they were Jewish themselves. I'm not saying about Smolar and Gross. I'm speaking more of Kuron, Bartoszewski, and Lipski. Perhaps, but you have to remember that these were people who went through all this themselves. So they had a certain. They were afraid to stir up anti-Semitism. So perhaps it wasn't because they were from the liberal center, but because they had the syndrome of people who were aware and who had a sense of fear. They wanted to cover up with certain nobleness. So phrasing it along the class lines is a mistake. I don't agree with you, Kaja, because I think that it wasn't like this. I think you can see it during the Second World War. You could see how it was shaped. There is a good book by Elżbieta Janiska about the book, about the time, called Festung Warschau. You could see that the circles that were most open-minded in the home army, most open to the Jews, certain ways were built of creating self-image and blocking out the fact of complicity. It's not only Kossak Szczucka, it's also Kamiński. I will gladly enter this discussion, but perhaps when it's a separate discussion, because I don't share your point of view. If I may have my own point of view as a moderator, perhaps you don't realize what the burden was, the burden of a certain experience. For example, my grandfather Wienawer, who with Aniela Steinsberg, then later defended Kazimierz Szczerek after the war. Could you accuse them of being so afraid that they didn't want to show the Jewishness? It was a whole range of behavior was simply a result of those people being survivors of a genocide, and not because they were liberal. I'm sorry, I have to. I'm stopping to speak. I'm passing the floor to Konstanty Gebert. I think there is another fundamental problem. There is not only Polish. There is the Holocaust cannot be thrown away. You cannot speak about Europe after the Holocaust without the Holocaust. At the same time, there is nothing, and there can be nothing that would close the issue. Namely, there's no actions, activities, whatever they could be, after which you could say, okay, now we understand everything, the case is closed. And the feeling, the sense that you can't omit the Holocaust, you can't not speak about it. You can't try to interact with it, and at the same time you can't talk with it, and definitely you can't close the subject. And this paralyzes a lot, irrespectively of your class origin or your political position or your degree of complicity or innocence. In a certain sense, it is good because it shows, because it's not our problem only, it's also a problem in Rwanda. The Turks have it after the Armenian genocide. It shows that you can't simply live as normal after a genocide. Genocide paralyzes and makes you hopeless, and you don't really know how to get over it, especially if you have the situation like Poland in this case, that it wasn't us Poles, it wasn't us, the citizens of the Republic of Poland, it was the Germans. So it's not our problem to educate the young generations. Let someone else do it. Paradoxically, Kaja, the Germans find it easier because they have nowhere to hide, and we can hide behind them. The Germans have to face it. They've created this notion of Wiedergutmachung, where actually you cannot do it this way, but they have nowhere else to hide. And we pose that we're both victims and witnesses and bystanders and complicit. We have so many historical, rhetorical places, conceptual places where we can hide. We find it easier to refuse to look at Gorgona in the eyes, and you pay a high price for it. Tomek, I think that, after all, Polish culture is full of such signals from the 1940s, where you see a certain necessity of confronting the problem of implicity. As, let's say, the Poor Christians Look at the Ghetto by Czesław Miłosz, the image of the mole who drills some graves, and it turns out that the graves are the graves of Polish unawareness, and we see those graves later in the film Aftermath, the film Wesele, in the Demon, in many films, in the Birthplace by Grünberg. And in some way, they not only determine the attitude of someone who looks at a crime committed by someone else, but someone who looks at their own actions and the results of those actions. So despite us being within their trade, perpetrators, victims, and bystanders, as Hilbig stated, nevertheless, I think it should be modified, and we should see that this participation and the fear to see complicity is fundamental, it's essential, I think. Yes, but I just wanted to point out that the secret of complicity of Poles in the Holocaust was in those years a common secret of the survivors and the Polish society. It was very scary to speak about it. Both, also the survivors, those who stayed, not those who left Poland, because they spoke about Poland as a nightmare that they didn't want to come back to. Ziemowit, tell us, what do you think about it? Should we stop talking about the Jews and take an aerial view of the whole region? Or is there anything to it that the Holocaust actually influenced the mechanisms of today so much that you can't accept it, you can't reject it? Definitely, I think that the experience of the Holocaust the experience of life, not only during the war, but also before the war and after the war. Um, puppet with the rhythm of pogroms, not only pogroms that happened somewhere far, but pogroms that happened in intellectual centers. For example, in the Jewish district of big cities. So it was like functioning from existing from pogrom to pogrom, from having one stage of life finished to ended to having another period of life ended. And this is a really very stressful thing. I think the scale of this trauma that made people such as Stanisław Lem, that made them sort of simply cover with sand their Jewishness, remain silent about it, as you, Kazimiera, said, in the company of people who did something bad to you. You cannot bring it up because you're afraid. It's a natural reaction. So it's difficult not to speak about it. It's difficult not to repeat it, and at the same time to search for an image that would pierce the hearts of those that don't understand it, and an image that would bring out the sadness of the terrible experience. I understand that the way for finding this is going on, but I have this tendency to look for broader context, and really to take an aerial view from which you can see a bigger region, but sometimes also to look to go down to the ground and look from the ground level. It was a nice scene when Kolski was filming pornography, his film, and the motif, the partisan motif, the wartime motif, was shown by a camera that actually was filming at the grassroots level, really at the grassroots level, going through the forest, and this was really telling. So what I try to do is to incorporate all these problems of Poles, the existence of Poles and Jews and Germans, and however we divide ourselves, peasants, townspeople. I try to seek for the dependencies that are not so obvious, that look beyond the most kind of traditional perspectives that we look through. I think that the ethnic division is oversimplified, because looking through it, we're discarding tools for certain reconciliation. The ethnic division shouldn't be, of course, completely discarded, but if you look at Bosnia, where ethnicities were problematic during the Second World War, after the war, a study was created that was multi-ethnic, with Bosnians and Croats and Serbians, but this again created like a mill again, where all the three ethnicities were ground together. I agree that perhaps some of the post-transformation time middle class that complemented that, what you call the liberal center, whatever its borders are, we silently sort of acknowledged, silent acknowledgement was perhaps a cause of the fact that we have those electrical tension at the moment. But it's difficult to imagine a community that wouldn't resemble the toxic Polishness from the interwar period. When you look at what happened in Lviv, in only the the army, the Polish army that started looting and murdering Jews in Kleparów, the Kleparów district of Lviv, and in Zamarstynov. It wasn't the army who accused the Jews of collaborating with the Ukrainians, but it was also those who came. So it was not only the local army, the local fighters, but also people who came, the army units that came from outside Lviv. So these were people who grew up in this virulent anti-Semitism that they got from the church, from the nobility, and also from what the current government is doing, actually from, well, everybody's saying that they refer to, everyone's saying that the current government refers to as called simple man, ordinary man. But assuming that this simple Polish man is at the same time as a conservative, anti-Semitic Boer, is actually pushing him into that kind of image. And it is actually a very ugly image. It's like creating a blackface. It's like when white in the American South covered the faces with some kind of black color and sort of pretended to speak either Southern black way. And this is like creating a caricature. So by describing the so-called Polish man this way is creating a caricature of him. So I think this is our two enemies are the ethnic perspective, and two, the populist sort of attack on against those who are not with us. And only then, when we start to undermine both, we can create some kind of frame on which a canvas can be stretched, or we could paint a new Poland, new republic, new Commonwealth. Let me refer to the middle class again. How else, if not by sort of enhancing this weak Polish liberal tolerant society, can we somehow start building things on it? But the very moment when we the circles, the milieu of Gazeta Wyborcza, for example, or the former Freedom Union, or starting building society on European liberal values, particularly in the economic sense of the word, when they started building society on those liberal values, so how we now, having sort of awakened this society, we can't attack them openly and treat them the same as fascists from Bąkiewicz. I'm not surprised that people who've been educated in asking questions keep asking questions, because this is what it's all about. Perhaps I touched you too much, Tomek. To some extent, I agree that historically, looking at it historically, we can question, of course, we can deconstruct certain things that Bartoszewski wrote. It's very interesting, but we cannot say that the liberal center is responsible now for this discussion, that it's long, that this discussion is long. I feel stupid to be asking those questions. I would like you kind of to spontaneously take part in the discussion, but like to ask you, Bożena, we're all Poles here with different roots, these or those. We are all Polish. So it's a strange question, perhaps. What are we afraid of? Because traditionally Jews were afraid of anti-Semitism, and rightly so. The Ukrainians were afraid. Poles were afraid of Ukrainians. Ukrainians were afraid of Poles. Now there are Ukrainians in Poland. Many of them are cheap labor force and are often humiliated. If you want to ask a question in the chat box, why can't the Liberal Centre be blamed for? It's quite often that we're the only media that actually took up certain questions. Anyway, Bożena, what are we afraid of? We are members of the Polish community. We are the Polish Republic. What are we afraid of? I'll get back to your question in a moment, but please let me refer, please, to what has been discussed so far, but because it stirs up emotions in me, and I might explode if I don't refer to them. I think in our discussion, we've put together a few periods. So we didn't really know what period we were discussing. I understand that Tomasz, speaking of the Liberal Centre, spoke of the Third Polish Republic, democratic Poland, of the liberal environment, absolutely represented by Gazeta Wyborcza, but not only, because you could include it into it all those non-right-wing weeklies. I would say the following, but yes, this is how it was, that Gazeta Wyborcza, well, I can't avoid it, but there was nothing left of Gazeta Wyborcza, and Gazeta Wyborcza took up topics related to Polish anti-Semitism, but it was done like from here to here. And if some voice fell outside the borders introduced, it was considered crazy, mad. And this voice had to wait. You, Kasia, said the following: what are we afraid of as Poles, etc., etc.? I want to say, I am not Poles. I don't feel Polish. I'll specify what I mean in a moment. I wanted to refer to what Ziemowit Szczerek said. I really liked what you said, because I also think that, like you, our problem is looking through the perspective of ethnicity as a kind of basis, a common denominator, and the question is, what would this mean? What is this? Some ethnicity. How are we to define Polishness that I don't feel a part of? Because after quoting Roman Kurkiewicz, who said, who wrote a story of how he, with his students of journalism, how they tried to understand what the essence of Polishness should be, and after a long debate, they realized that it's sort of like the 12 dishes for the Christmas Eve supper, but definitely, but it's not the empty plate for an unexpected guest. Because when he asked his journalism students if they invited anyone who would knock on the door unexpectedly, no, this empty additional plate is not for someone to invite some stranger, but simply it's there because it's part of the tradition. Why do I not feel Polish? Because being a Pole, unlike being a French woman, doesn't in Poland mean being a citizen. It means being a Pole and nothing else. And being a Pole is an ethnic category in Poland. And the citizenship category does not function in Poland. It also doesn't function between Poles themselves. And I would say this: the title of our discussion contains fears, Polish fears. So indeed, I would say The Polish fears are what constitutes the Polish community. Beyond those fears, we can find nothingness, void, and an abyss, and nothing that is substantial. A second thing, except for fears, what constitutes a community is an imagination, but also practice of instituting violence. The local tradition, I don't want to say Polish tradition. Now, the local tradition is, which is greatly described by books that have mushroomed now recently, such as the peasant history of Poland, the books about serfdom and the books by Janicki. They all show the most fundamental relation, the local relation, was the relation of violence. So, putting it short, the violence of a nobleman, that is a Pole, a nobleman whose only assets, possessions were people, peasants, serfs, who had to produce, and he had nothing else except for them. So it was in his interest to squeeze as much as possible out of those people, as of the serfs, and in their interest was to protect themselves. So this is the terrible legacy for any community. But what has been left of it is the relation of violence. Many people, it was very visible under communism in communist Poland. I don't think it was because of social realism, but it was due to the fact that there were people migrated from the countryside to towns and cities, especially in the 1960s. And almost everybody that was in a relation of what they thought they could interpret as a power relation, although in fact it was a relation of services. Even the lady who sold tram tickets, or not to mention doctors, treated as a power relations, and the people on the other side considered it a power relation and considered the other side to be in the position of power. So as I said, violence. The idea of equality has not been accepted much, and it's not understood. So, which is why perhaps people stick to ethnicity, and I also think that it's a disaster. Nothing good comes out of it. But the idea of equality, for example, after the French Revolution, the idea of equality was about that it was the people who spoke to the upper classes, that if you wanted to be citizens, if they spoke to aristocrats, if you want to be citizens, that of course you can under this and this condition. But what happened in Poland, actually, symbolically, what happened is that the whole peasant, the whole common people accepted to being Poles, which means actually nobility. So all former peasants have accepted the upper position in the power relation of violence. So now we can all have it out on the others, and I can have it out on you, and I can treat you through the power relation. And I do think that the circles, I don't think if middle class actually exists in Poland much, but perhaps to some extent it does. But the circles that call themselves liberal, who once we had joined the European Union could tell a more friendly history, narrative of a more friendly world where it's not the power relation of violence, but the relation of cooperation, which is doesn't go down well in Poland. Cooperation. Leave aside the Jews, but or those Poles who are speaking Romanian. A neighbor could be your enemy, and definitely there were enemies in every village, and there were enemies between villages. One village was hostile to another village. There was no wedding without hostility. It's not a Polish thing, Kazimiera Szczuka says. It's not, Bożena Keff adds. But in Poland, it can be very concretely told. Perhaps it's also typical, similar to what goes on in Russia. Perhaps I'm not a specialist on Orthodox Christianity, but perhaps certain communities options were created in Russia, and Russians who can be exclusivist can be also including, and Poles, I think they can't do it this way. I understand that other histories can also be told the same way, but why should we speak other histories and not stick to our own history? One more sentence. Relating to what Bożena Keff said. I've written it. I've written many times in essays that when the nationalists shout Poland, we should feel the courage to shout the Commonwealth, Polish Commonwealth or Republic, but we don't do it. We've been made feel afraid with that shout Poland, and we have a responsibility for the future generations who will be judging us. They will be looking at us. The fact that this should be our slogan, Commonwealth or Republic. The liberals have done only a little bit, and they could have done, should have done more. I just wanted to add one more sentence. We're speaking of the liberal center, but you could also use the term liberal elite, which is also sometimes used both in the left wing and the right wing of the political scene. It's not that we can't blame anyone, the liberal elites for anything, but we can't do it ahistorically. This is what I just wanted to say. I agree, completely agree. I think that for our former president, Bronisław Komorowski, the cursed soldiers and this very superficial image of a Polish community when that Jew was like an inn owner, tavern owner. So it was maintained in the liberal circuits, but it doesn't mean that all members of those liberal elites were like President Komorowski. I think that there was some I think that the Jewish part of the liberal elites were expected to it would have been better if Polish Poles took up certain issues, like the issue of complicity in the Holocaust. It would be better if ethnic Poles spoke about it. I'm not saying that you can't disclose the past of, say, your family, how they died. I'm just saying that looking at it historically, this is how people thought. By saying that this is what was thought, I mean Gazeta Wyborcza. I have Gazeta Wyborcza in mind. but they thought that the debate should be moderated very delicately. And it was carried on and carried it on well, because after all, books like yours, Tomek, and Eleyanitska's, and many others, and many books have been coming out after all. What we have to do now is actually to regain school and education, to start speaking about such things gradually to young people. Okay, Bożena now, and then Konsti. I just want to relate to what you said. Unfortunately, we have to judge it, because otherwise we won't be able to say anything. Yeah, I am critical of the liberal elites for I'm critical of them, that they thought that Polish Poles should speak about Polish complicity. I think this kind of way of thinking is anti-Semitic, and Tomek Żukowski and Eleyanitska sort of write against this way of thinking, and sometimes along those lines. But I spoke, Kazimiera Szczuka says, I spoke historically about it. This came to existence in a very complex way, complicated way, and I agree with Ziemowit that the discourse of Gestapo Borcza was often very irritating. I'm defending it to some extent, so it might have been irritating, but at least it was there. I think that there is silver lining to every cloud. I think that we should start the discussion of taking skeletons out of the closet, but at the same time, everything was spoken about. All subjects were taken up. The liberal center was difficult. I mean, you couldn't expect them not to stop being liberal against their own convictions. Also take the fact that it was spoken about in Poland, not only in the liberal and intellectual center, but in a broader perspective. So the fact that we now have a few dozen % of Poles who vote for the left wing and von Hołownia and for I think that's it for a country like Poland. This percentage is actually strong. Tomek, please say something. Konstanty Gebert, I wanted to say something. But you, Tomek, I think you've spoken only once. And then Konstanty Gebert. I just wanted to say that when we look historically at our liberal center, and we think about the borders of what was allowed to say it, about taboo exclusion in that discourse of our liberal elites, then it doesn't mean attacking or accusing anyone, but we simply asking, we're just asking about our own self-awareness as people who are their continuators. That self-awareness is not an attack. Awareness of restrictions is not a guilt, but it's simply indispensable to understand certain historical processes. And the processes are that the center in Poland has moved to the right a lot. And the problem is that in the field of Polish patriotism and the defense of Polish self-image, we cannot win with the right wing. We can only lose against them. And this is what actually has happened now. So what is going on at the moment is the fact that we start speaking about exclusion, and this is very important. And I think Bożena, what Bożena said about fears was very interesting. I don't think there is nothing outside the fears. There must be something, I believe. So what is there? I think there is a desire to confront what has been suppressed, what has been pushed aside, what has been forgotten. So I have an example of a sample from 1963 film Nagania, Chaser, about Poles chasing Jews hand in hand with the Germans. But then we have a bestseller from this year, a wedding, where you have a very literal with image, with sexual violence, with all the horror of pogroms that is shown, that is made conspicuous. And I think that our fears can lead us either to suppression, to repeat our suppression, and then if we repeat suppression, and we repeat violence. If we fear the other, and we push back the immigrants over the border again. The same story from the late 1930s. Or perhaps the other way is to confront what causes fear in us, and then this can create a movement towards self-awareness. Janek Borowicz wrote about it very well. When I talked to him, he said the pedagogy of guilt should be introduced in contrast to pedagogy of shame, because a feeling of guilt can create a sense of a feeling of complicity, and we feel responsible for something that happened, that we stop feeling the history is kind of a bulldozer running over us, but we take over control over ourselves and our history. So, and the chorus, the choir of people who say it wasn't me, it was someone else, is really strong and numerous. But there are also people who say, let's look at it, let something happen, let's look at it, let's confront it. And so these voices are also more and more heard, audible, more and more audible. Yes, Kazimiera Szczuka said. Konstanty Gebert now. Thank you, Kazimiera. I feel stupid to pass the floor to you, but because we are online, so we have to I have to direct it somehow. I have to guide you. Konstanty. Bożena, one news said that Polishness is also about, it's only about fear and violence. This is the basis actually of the identity of every ethnic group. It's not only Polish, because ethnic groups aggregate and last because they fear others, and also because they find ways to deal with others. There is a beautiful Arabic saying, I against my brother, I and my brother against the rest of the family, my family against the rest of the clan against the whole world. This is how you build ethnic identity. And there is nothing Polish about it. And the Second Republic identity of nationalists with elements of violence is doing well and lives on. And the large part of Israeli society imported from around the Vistula River and is doing very well around the Jordan River. These are not specifically Polish things. And as a footnote, I'd like to say, would you say that the situation in Russia is different, and you attribute it to Orthodox Christianity? I would attribute it to the climate. I spoke to one of the last Jewish families who remained in Barnaul in central Siberia. Everybody else had left, and they liked winter and snow, like I do also myself. And they stayed. They didn't leave for Israel because they said, in Israel, when they want to have winter, they climb Mount Hermon to see a bit of snow on the top of it. So I asked that Misha Schwartz, and how about anti-Semitism here? He said, what anti-Semitism? It's minus 40 degrees. What anti-Semitism? When it's 40 degrees below zero, the state freezes. And if people cannot rely on each other, you cannot have the sentence that they can rely on each other, then everybody will die here. So what jokes people tell about each other, that has no importance, actually. My grandfather of blessed memory said sort of similar things what you said, Ziemowit, about Poles and members of the Commonwealth Republic. He said, don't scare me with nations. I want to live in a society. Everybody would, but for a nation to turn into a society, what it takes is a certain period of safety. I don't know how long, but it's something that cannot be done over a few years only. But after all, we've had a long period of we've had a long period of a theoretical danger. The question is whether things are changing for the better or for the worse. Generally, they're going towards the worse, but it makes angry those people who grew up in this period of relative peace over the last 30 years. And paradoxically, we are more and more open than I would say in 2015, when the law and justice were taking over power. But I think that it's a kind of imported openness, because many of us live in multinational, multi-ethnic societies. It's much more difficult to do in our largely homogeneity. I'm not afraid of important things, but the historical reaction of a majority of our society against the group of a few dozen of refugees that Poland would be able to accept without any problems. 80,000 Chechens entered Poland some 2 decades ago. The fact how it's presented is catastrophic. It's how quickly we have started being inhumane towards such a small danger. Kasia, can I continue speaking? This reaction is very significant and very important, because I think it sort of fits into a vision of history of the 20th century that is strong in Poland. But you can also find, to some extent, a similar version of it in Hungary, in Serbia, in Turkey. And it looks like this. That the 20th century was a nightmare. Millions of people murdered, real bloodshed, but at least, finally, we are among ourselves. We are safe. Those terrible aliens are not among us. Those who've been a threat to us. It's a lyrical, I would say, delusion that so many of us would like to live in the Poland of the Jagiellonian dynasty of the 16th century. Many of us would like to live in the nationalist Poland. So if affluence and prosperity causes that we are among ourselves, Poles among Poles, Hungarians against Hungarians, or like Le Pen says, we are at home finally. So in this situation, letting in some aliens would be criminally irresponsible, according to this way of thinking, would be a betrayal of this sacrifice of blood that our grandfathers shed for our country to be largely monoethnic. I would not agree with you. Because I think that the people at the border are afraid more of Lukashenko than of the refugees. And the fact that Ukrainians were relatively well accepted. On the border, there are also those who feel themselves local, who don't describe themselves as Belarusian or Polish. They would say, I'm here, I'm from this local village. So they're not afraid of aliens as aliens, of others as others, the way Lydia Staron is afraid, who claims that if we let them in, that they will rape our daughters and it will change our identity. And this fear of the other, who undermines our imagination of prosperity, is what we're stumbling on, what we're tripping on continually. And there's no possibility of building a normal crime without accepting that people come and people go, and there is a diversity. Someone might like it, I like it. Someone might dislike it, and it's their right. But this doesn't change the situation. And until we accept their reality, we will we'll feel critical of it. And the worst solution is building walls. The wall that's being created on the Belarusian border. Actually, it encompasses the whole of Poland, including the coast of the Baltic Sea. And finally, according to this vision, we'll be among ourselves, with ourselves. And this is what I'm afraid of. I don't want to point with a finger at anyone now. Please, whoever feels like speaking, please. During our meetings here, during our panel discussions in here, many document statistics were quoted. I remember that Professor Krzemiński, a sociologist, quoted Professor Michał Bilewicz's research that an increase in radical, drastic nationalist attitudes is offset with a parallel anti-fascist attitudes, that there is an increase on both sides, and one offsets the others. So we can't say that it's really bad and the fascism will swallow us up, because the awareness of people who were sort of numb and indifferent woke up. Let me speak of. As for Rzeczpospolita, Commonwealth, you could die, and as for Poland, you could kill, and Poland seems to more attractive and sexy, where this final extreme liminal dimension of fulfillment doesn't exist. Whether Poland is Catholic or pagan doesn't make much difference. The word Rzeczpospolita, the Commonwealth, also has the Tatars, Jews, Ukrainians in it. But what Commonwealth seemed more open, and the connotations for the word Poland are much more narrow, like Catholic Pole. Many people don't know where they know it from, but this is the way they think. All constructs have to be created, so let us create other constructs as well. Ziemowit, yes, this is what we are. This is what we're trying. Can I refer to what Konstanty said? I'd like to. We can say, of course, that human groups, when a community is created, whatever it is based on, immediately we differentiate between us and them, our people and aliens, and we treat the aliens, the others, the way we are. But I don't think we are at the beginning of human culture. I think we have moved on a little bit, because if we are a bit further on, then I would say the mechanisms, no, they differentiate, and culture studies have different categories to describe various cultures. There's well-known culture specialist, I think Hofstede, I think a Dutchman. I remember the title of the book. It's a classic. And Hofstede lists a few categories of cultural categories according to which you can classify and describe cultures, as long as we don't accept that we are at the beginning of the formation of various human groups. And perhaps a few thousand years ago, this is what it was like, but now human cultures are different and have differentiated. I'm not trying to negate the fact that there are common things, but we see diversity and differentiation. And we see it, for example, when we go to, say, an average Polish doctor, and when we go to a Dutch doctor or a French doctor, we'll see the difference with the naked eye. And Hofstede says, among the categories that I remember, it's a course book that I haven't read it for a long time now. But one of the main descriptive categories is what he calls distance of power. So cultures differ in how they see, perceive, how they allow and practice the distance of power to the average participant of this community. Let me go to this phrase. So there are cultures where power authority is very far. They can do things. They can show the affluence. They can link affluence with power. You plead with the government to beg for something, and there are societies who say that no, the government authorities, these are our representatives, they're not far. You cannot link richness with being a representative of power of a government. Poland is probably would be a mixed type. There are cultures, Hofstede says, that he describes as masculine cultures and feminine cultures. He doesn't understand it the way it's understood in a stereotypical way. He understands it as that feminine cultures are those cultures that create, produce society that takes care of each other and its intent focuses on care. This is where the idea of the welfare state comes from, where conflicts are negotiated and people know how to negotiate conflicts, and violence is put aside as a means that is absolutely extreme and that can be used. And in this sense, Poland is, as a culture, as masculine culture and patriarchal culture. I'm listening to your question now. So which country is so feminist, as you said? He gave examples. He listed countries, that feminine countries that he listed. Well, actually, all countries are mixed, but those that are more feminine, you can see, you can tell by the number of, by the percentage of women that are members of the government at the central level, by the women's rights, by understanding the women's rights as human rights. So probably we should aim at Scandinavia and Holland, as always. In feminine countries, minorities are included in the mainstream. It's very inclusive. Also remember the attitude towards novelty. This is what Hofstede also mentioned. cultures respond very differently to what is new, to novelties. You can be afraid, you can be interested and curious, you can be wary. I'm not going to develop it now. Even if you look at how Column described various Native American tribes, some of them were closed and some of them were open, some of them were hostile, some of them were open and very hospitable. So it's not that we all respond the same way, because we're not at the initial stage of our human culture. Our communities, cultures have their own idioms now. I mentioned Russia, and so there is some different tradition concerning community. Perhaps there's more to it than what Tomek described along the psychoanalytical lines about Poland, but I think those cultures are different. I don't know, I listen to classical music and operas, and indeed you can say in which countries musical culture is more developed, in which it is less developed, and so on and so forth. This is what I wanted to say. But I think this is a misunderstanding. Of course, that cultures differ. And of course, there are certain notions, and I would say that Polish cluster of notions is not typical of Poland only. It says as much about us as it says about the Turks, the Arabs, and many others. And of course, cultures differ. Thanks God. This is the main argument why it's better to live in a society than a nation. As for this distance to power, to the government, I think we should look at the various indexes. In Poland, you used to say, used to call a policeman, address them as per authority. But also have to remember that the Dutch doctor works in a much well-organized, much more affluent healthcare system, but also, so Bożena, he or she works in a different culture. Of course, there are differences, and of course, Scandinavia is different than Afghanistan. But I'd like to ask whether you would agree whether my thesis, heading towards a kind of summary of our discussion, the shocked day, if you look at Poland, that people are so easy to manipulate. And the fact that things like what's going on the Polish-Russian, Belarusian border, that things like this can happen, where people, as you said, Konstanty, where people quite often say that they are local, they're from the village. I spoke about Narewka. This is true indeed. We can't be overly critical of our society. There are some positive reactions, but after all, at the border, people die, and this is happening for the first time in I don't know how. We are actually causing the death of people who try to get to Poland, and I think that when I'm saying that society is so easy to manipulate, is allowing to be manipulated when the government tells them not to care about it, that the government is taking control of the situation. the cost of dead bodies being dragged over from side to side of the border. And I think the majority actually has accepted the situation, sadly. And I think this has fallen on a fertile ground. On one hand, we have connotations, memories of the interwar period and of the Holocaust wartime period. And we have connotations, we feel analogies, but at the same time, many of us don't want to look at it, close their eyes. I just want to say, I don't want to say that the breeding ground that you mentioned is not particularly Polish, but European, but it's but I just want to say that societies of France and mobilized for the sake of the refugees much more than Poland, but the hypocrisy of the state authorities is the same. And the EU has expressed solidarity with Poland because opening the border to refugees in Poland would actually show the hypocrisy of how refugees are treated in the Mediterranean Sea, and the Italian problems would be clear. At least we don't do refugee camps like camps are done in Turkey or Libya. I think this is a generally European disgrace, not only a Polish disgrace. But I want to say that there's a small number of those people at the border, people sent over, of course, by Lukashenko. And the situation is absolutely, I think, manageable without any big problem. And yet, it's been processed this way and put across this way, so that we, as a community, should fall into a certain mechanism of fear that we are among ourselves, and here the others are coming. In today's Gazeta Wyborcza, there's a good example of children's drawing, which shows refugees with rifles, with guns. And the same kind of accusation, like the Nazi accusation against Jews, accusing Jews allegedly of wanting to rule the world. Bosak, the member of Polish Parliament, right winger, actually has told you what to do. What summary would you propose? There was a meeting a few years ago in the Praga district of Warsaw, when the city wanted to open an out clinic for people addicted to drugs, and the local community inhabitants protested. The city organized a meeting of the doctors of that out clinic with the local inhabitants, and the inhabitants started to shout, "Drug addicts, prostitutes, criminals, away with them, we don't want them here." There were a lot of people under their influence. And at a certain point, a young doctor who wanted to open the out clinic there stood up, and she said, "Thank you very much for the meeting. I've learned quite a lot. And of course, in this situation, we will not carry out this project here. We'll try to implement it somewhere else. Because you see, we are afraid of you more than you are afraid of us." And I think we do live in a very dangerous piece of the world, like many other nations. But nevertheless, it is a dangerous piece of the world. But at the beginning, you said that it's a very secure piece of land. The old Uzbek who told my mother in central Russia that there is no place for Poland on the map. was right. So we should fear, but we also should fear of ourselves. And societies that have learned this skill, not to trust their own impulses. These are societies that historically do much better, and I would like us to start to learn to fear ourselves, to fear each other, to fear our own reactions. Fear our own reactions, as Konstanty Gebert. When I'm saying to feel ourselves, I don't mean we have to fear my neighbor. I want to fear myself, not to trust myself completely. It's very liberal, Konstanty. Bożena. I just want this. It was very liberal what you said. I think we should treat liberals also as a positive thing, as far as liberalism and as a kind of philosophical idea is. Can also give rise to some positive narrative, which unfortunately hasn't happened. Didn't happen at a certain point, which I'm very critical of. But I think we should only, in the case of Poland, we should only fear our own unawareness of our inaction. If there is any solution here, after all, it's true that Poland has polarized, has become a polarized society, and we have to accept that it's not our side, if I can put it this way, is in power at the moment, and I'm not happy that we have polarized. We don't have to try and seek easy consolations. Let's not seek easy consolations. There is room for a country here, but we have to design the country in a way where its own people have a trust for each other. Of course, I'm speaking of a kind of collective awareness, of our self-awareness as a country. So what are we to fear, to be afraid of? We should be afraid of living through myths and ideologies that have mushroomed recently. I could even give an example. I could pinpoint the myth of the Smolensk catastrophe, the myth behind it. So, and there's more and more myth, and we should be afraid of this, and be afraid of quick impulses. It's not just that Poles, ethnic Poles in particular, they suddenly have become so much afraid of those refugees. This readiness to fear was there, but it was also stimulated. That's true through propaganda, but perhaps the same strong propaganda perhaps wouldn't have influenced the same way people whose culture idiom is different. So we should be afraid of vulnerability, actually of susceptibility, and we should try and understand where the susceptibility comes from, and not seek easy consolation. Professor Żukowski, what do you think we should be afraid of? We shouldn't be afraid of things. We should start thinking. I would propose, of course, you're right. It's right that certain reactions are generally human, but it doesn't give us much. It doesn't tell us much about ourselves. So perhaps understanding that these are generally human problems, we should ask ourselves how they work in our Polish context. Perhaps in our culture, perhaps then we would see that this element of violence at the Polish-Belarusian border is somehow symbolic. That we're not actually confronting a Syrian, Iraqi, or some kind of imagined being that it lives in our unconscious, and perhaps we want to get rid of that element. Perhaps the situation of the Zbonchen problem of 1938, 1939 is recurring, and what's happening there perhaps is a post-Holocaust, deep post-Holocaust problem and fear, and we're not ready to confront the Polish violence that took place in the Holocaust, and I think it hasn't reached sufficient intensity yet. So I think perhaps we shouldn't be afraid of, but we should not be afraid of, and work on our fears. Ziemowit, what should be afraid of? So we should not be afraid of things. Think, that's true. I think we should try to learn, keep distance to ourselves. What is the weakness of our fathers? Let it be our strength. Andrzej Mleczko had a situation like once. He described a situation where an officer mounted on a horse rose his saber and shouted to his soldiers, "Forward, soldiers, forward!" And the soldiers actually disappeared, disappearing in the crowd. And one of them says, "Actually, well, we should first think where to go." A pun on Polish words that is untranslatable, unfortunately. What I'm afraid of is that the current government is going to prolong the government, the power, and this will completely destroy our country, and that the Polish Commonwealth of our dreams and fantasies will fall apart and will never materialize, or perhaps it will materialize after the end of the world. And I'm simply sorry for Poland. Poland, or the Polish Commonwealth. It's a traditional summary of a Polish debate, Okay, so let us say goodbye to each other. I'm closing the discussion now. Thank you very much for your participation. Konstanty, thank you. Bożena, Tomasz Żukowski, Ziemowit Szczerek, for all the fantastic books that you've written. Especially the Victorious Commonwealth. Give us an idea what it might be when it actually materializes. But it's literature, I think, fiction, and we have to build. And I'm very sorry for interrupting you every now and then, especially Konstanty. It is good to be interrupted in a wise way, in an interesting way. Let's love each other. Let's love our country. No, but I'm saying, I don't know. Let's like it, says Ziemowit. Let's like our country. Let's work on being able to like this country. I see nothing wrong and loving each other. It's an appeal to Poland. Poland, let yourself be make yourself likable. Thank you very much. When is the next meeting going to happen? I don't know, but thank you very much. Goodbye.